to a beginner's guide to mixing metal at home with me, James MSV. This is episode 3. We're going to be dealing with the guitars, and it's going to be split into 2 parts because there's a lot to talk about with this. Part 1 is going to talk about preparation, which is very important with guitars in metal. You've really got to think about how they're going to sit in the whole mix. You've got to have an overview of your end result before you even really start to get your guitar sound. So this part is going to discuss that. If you're already happy with your guitar sound and you want a bit more information about how to clean it up and sit it well in the mix, then please skip straight to part 2. You will see the navigation buttons down the left hand side of the screen here. You can maybe skip to a part of the episode that you're interested in. Otherwise, hopefully part 2 will give you a bit more specific information on how to process your guitars. So part 1 here, we're going to deal with how to think about the type of sound you want, how to achieve that sound, how to decide where you want your guitars to end up, because it's very important that you do this early on. Otherwise, when you come to your mixing stage, you may find that you have to completely redo your guitars if you haven't thought it through properly. Preparation, I cannot stress this enough with guitars, really is the key, because also with guitars, they don't suffer processing as well as some other instruments like drums or even the bass. Guitars can start to sound very bad very quickly if you don't do things properly right from the get-go. So let's get straight on with it because there's a lot to cover. First thing to think about with your guitars is the stereo space where they're going to be sitting. If I bring up this graphic here, it's pretty obvious and it's very standard for some of the major instruments to be running down the centre, either in mono or in such a stereo effect that makes them sound like they're running straight down the centre. And that is the kick and the snare for the drums, obviously very important. There's the bass, and your vocals are going to sit, if not mono down the middle, then very close in a stereo formation, probably in most cases down the middle. They're all very prominent, very important instruments in any mix, so that's the last place you want any guitars because it's cluttered as it is down the middle. Rule number 1 then, never mono a guitar down there. At the very least, you want one stereo guitar. When it comes to stereo guitars, please try not to use a chorusing effect over one guitar. It doesn't sound very good in heavy metal. It may get away with it if you're using one acoustic guitar for some acoustic break or what have you, but when it comes to a heavy guitar, you want at least 2 guitar tracks panned so that you get the stereo effect. It also adds fullness to the sound, even if if you've got 2 guitarists and they're playing slightly differently, but tight enough for it to work well, it can sound really good. A chorus effect just sounds fake. It may work in industrial, but it won't work in any other type of heavy metal. Next question then is where to pan to. The natural reaction would be pan 100% left, 100% right. Not always the best thing to do. It may work well if you're only using one guitar on each side to give you some space, but you will also find that if you pan it slightly in a bit, maybe at about 70 or 80%, you're creating a slightly louder, fuller sound automatically without having to adjust your volume and without adjusting anything in the guitars. They'll sound louder without having to be louder, and so that will give you more energy in your mix without causing you to clip. Something that's personal taste, you will have to experiment with that. Another way around that is to maybe add in a second guitar track at a different pan to the first one. You may have a primary set of anything from 80 to 100%. It's called quad tracking, where you add in then a second layer of guitars either side, and you may pan that a bit closer in, maybe anything from 20 to 50, or you will have to experiment. And this is the problem with trying to explain guitars, is that you can explain a sort of theory like this, but then really you've got to go away and try it out and find out what works best for you and what sounds best with the sounds you're using. Or there is one other trick, which is what I'm going to be using and demonstrating today, because it's what I have found works best for me, and that is to take one guitar sound on each side, one left guitar, one right guitar, and rather than get a guitarist to play 3 left-hand channels and 3 right-hand channels, is to run that single left-hand signal through 3 different cabs, 3 different amps, and your end result is that it sounds like you're getting 3 guitars that are very, very tight together, but with three slightly different sounds gives you a really nice thick sound on each side. You can pan them slightly differently to really fill out that space. If you on this picture, it's easy to see that there's a lot of space out the sides. The cymbals running along the top there are covering most drummers will have cymbals across the whole stereo spectrum. They don't take out much energy from the guitars, and the same goes for the toms. Although they can be full of energy, they're not played all the time, so although they may be stereoed out left and right, they're not really interfering with your guitar. You've got a lot of space there at the side to use for the guitars, and you may as well spread them out a bit and use that space. So get rid of that graphic for now. So to talk more about how to get one guitar sounding like it's three guitars, I have to give a quick introduction to how you're going to create your basic sound with something like a VST amp sim. I've got Guitar Rig 3 up here as a good example. I'm afraid I don't deal in this episode with miking and recording live guitars. That's a very different skill. Unfortunately, I don't have the capacity at home to do that. There's a lot of people don't, so this will only deal with VSTs, I'm afraid. I've got here a general sort of sound that I've created that I use to jam on the computer. One couple of interesting points to show which will be valid for everybody. If we look at this Sledgehammer, this is a distortion rack sim, and a couple of things to note. You'll see my bass is near central, my treble's up to about only 6.5. The contour is like a presence, and that's only at about 6, and the frequency is what presence to effect is not too important, but you'll see there's no major EQing going on there. With guitars, you're best off never doing any major EQing. With some people like to strip out mids a lot, which can end up sounding pretty thin. You do want to make sure you get a good sound, but you don't want to go too extreme. It will cause you problems. It will be quite fatiguing on the ear. Most importantly, over here, the gain button, you'll see, or knob, you'll see I've got this down at about 4. Now that may surprise people quite a lot. The fun thing to do is whack that up to 10, but that will not work well if you're layering guitars. You are layering white noise of the distortion over white noise over and over. The more guitars you have, the more layering of that noise you'll get, and it starts to sound nasty. But I've only got this gain set at about 4, and you would be surprised how that works. It doesn't sound amazing on its own, but when we're 3 guitars in, it starts to sound really full. So do bear that in mind when you're creating your sound. The important thing here, though, what I wanted to go over was the cabinet and mic setup. Now, one guitar will go through one cab, and you can see here there's a microphone set up. I can choose to have it on or off axis, at the side, far away or close. They will all affect the guitar sound and will change the characteristics quite a lot. So again, have a mess around and see what you like there. And I also have microphone options. Now, I am showing this in Guitar Rig. You will have different mic and cab options and different VSTs, but most of them do give options for multiple settings, so this should still be relevant for you. That may sound okay, but with something like this setup, I may have a very full boomy sound, but I may be losing some high end. So what I would do is route it through a second cab. I might have an entirely different cab there and decide to go off axis or even on the edge. A different microphone to pick up the different characteristics of that mic setting, and that may give me a better high end. As I say, I like to add a third guitar, which may even be some different characteristics, might be a far away edge to give some space to it. Those 3 mixed together will give me a much better sound than just choosing one, because with one cab, one mic setting, you're not going to get everything that you want. You're not going to get a good low end, a good high end, a good amount of distortion, a good amount of space and air. It's impossible. You need multiple settings. You may want to use the same microphones, the same cabs, but I would definitely advise using different mic positionings. Now that, the one left guitar channel guitar would come through here, it gets split down these 3 cabs that I can change the volume of each independently, and that becomes 3 guitars being mixed together, and it's a much better, fuller sound than working with a single one. So that is the key really to getting a thick guitar sound. I can change the pans. I haven't done this yet because I've not set, this isn't the patch that I use for these songs, but I may want to pan one right all the way left, one to say 75, and one even maybe further at about 20-25, or I may want them all panned the same. experiment with that. You will find something that works really well for your music. Now, this is the type of subject where I could run on, and due to the 15-minute time limit, I'm going to have to sort of brush over this fairly quickly. Using Guitar Rig, fairly good visual representation of how you can use one guitar signal and send it through multiple speaker cabs and get a multi-layered sound, mixing the different elements really well. I'm going to get rid of those cabs though, because I never use them. Programs like Guitar Rig fall down, although they do good amp sounds, they fall down a bit when it comes to the cabs. Luckily though, a few years back, some very clever people developed probably the most important development for heavy metal guitars recorded at home, and that is something called guitar impulses. Please Google the term if you have not heard of it before. You may find it under the term convolution reverb. I'll try and put a link to a good site down below for you. What guitar impulses are, to cut out all of the sort of backstory, is they found a really good way of emulating speaker cabinets pretty much perfectly, and it will turn what would sound like a demo guitar in Guitar Rig done with a VST. If you add a speaker cabinet impulse, it will end up sounding pretty much like a real guitar, real live guitar. It's a great invention. So I've got Guitar Rig with a amp simulator. They're very good for that, no problem there. But then for the cabinet, I'm using Free VST by Voxengo. You may have heard of them. They do commercial VSTs that you have to pay for, but they also do some free ones like this. This is the Boogex. It's called a guitar amp, but really it's a cabinet impulse program. They have some free ones that come with it, different mic positions for 4x12s are particularly good for metal. You would choose one that you like. You've got an EQ there fairly obviously, don't need to tell you how that works. This emulates a speaker cabinet using an impulse. You can see down here, speaker cabinet impulse response, and that acts as my cabinet. So I've got an amp simulator and then a cabinet emulator, and together I get a very realistic sound. I don't actually use Guitar Rig for this particular metal sound I'm using though. I use another free one, which you'll be glad to hear. This is by a very clever French guy called Alain Lepeur. I'll put a link to him down below as well. Please visit his site. He's becoming more and more popular because he develops some absolutely tremendous stuff. I'm using two of his amps here, one on the left channel, one on the right. This is just to get a bit of variation in the sound. I can't tell you exact settings to get a good metal sound because your guitar will be different to mine. The other plugins you use might be different. You've really got to practice until you get a good ear for this sort of thing. You'll notice though my EQ, as I said earlier, doesn't go very far to any extreme. I've got the low on 4, the mid on 4.5 and the high on 5.5. Try not to go too extreme because it probably will bite you later on down the line. And my gain is only at about 70% there. Again, I'm layering the guitar, so I don't want too much in the way of gain on each channel. When they build together they'll sound great. I've then put, again by Alain Lepeur, I've put his cabinet impulse response program on the end there. Like Guitar Rig, I can put many in. I've got 3 on each side I can have. I've only lit up the left hand side there because this is purely my left hand channel. Put 3 different cabinet impulses in, all with or different mic settings, and I mix them or blend them to get the guitar tone that I want. That sounds far better than just one guitar because I can control the lows, I can control the highs on a different channel, and on a third the space, the sort of reverb and the ambience of the sound. One final point before we conclude this episode, one final trick you can add on is, before even the amplifier, is a signal booster. This is another free one. It's pretty good, the TSE 808. You can Google that to find it. But you can use basically any signal booster. The Cubase comes with a good free couple of ones here, the Green Gate and the Little Booster. Little Booster, see, similar idea, drive tone level, and this one even has some EQ notches which can be handy. What this does is regulates the signal into the amplifier. With the drive you can add a bit more crunch so that your gain sounds a bit fuller. You can alter the tone and the volume, but primarily the best thing this does is regulates the sound going in so that it's a nice even sound for the amplifier to work with. This benefits you later down the line, as you can see here. This is a bounce down version of those guitars, and what it's done by evening the tone, there's no massive peaks there. You can see it almost looks like a compressed signal even though it isn't. So the guitar sounds very alive, lots of dynamics. But when it comes to sitting in the mix, we're not causing any peaks that will give us any problems. I'll just give you a quick demonstration of how this sounds with and without the boost there. This is without the boost, and with. You can can see that boost fills out the sound quite nicely, and when you've bounced it down, as you can see from what I've done here, it gives a nice even guitar tone throughout the song. That concludes part 1, and when I come back for part 2, we're going to be discussing how we will group all of these layered guitars, EQ them properly, and add other processes like the compression and so on. So hopefully that gave you some good information, and you'll come back for part 2. See you then.